Hey everybody, welcome to my channel, and today we're going to look at the story of Cinderella. But before we do that, if you love anything to do with Disney, then make sure to check out our other videos. You might also want to consider subscribing so you never miss any new content. Well, let's get right into it. Once upon a time, in a faraway land, there lived a kind, gentle, and beautiful young woman named Cinderella. Her mother had passed away when Cinderella was very young, and her father, the lord of the manor, raised her all by himself. Sadly, he too would pass away a few years later, leaving Cinderella under the care of her uncle, who she hadn't seen since she was very little. Now, Cinderella's uncle was a wealthy landowner and widower. That is, he had recently married a cruel and evil woman with two equally wicked daughters named Drizella and Anastasia. Cinderella's stepmother hated everything about her. She despised Cinderella's beauty and was jealous of her charm and kindness. From the moment Cinderella's father died, her stepmother and stepsisters made her life hell. They forced her to cook and clean and do all the work around the house while they lounged about doing nothing. They would often yell at her and call her names just for fun, because she was usually covered in cinders or ashes from the fireplace. They mocked her and gave her the name Cinderella. One day, a royal invitation arrived from the king. He was hosting a grand royal ball in the palace for all the maidens in the kingdom in hopes that his son, the prince, would find a suitable wife. Cinderella dreamed of going to the ball, but when she told her stepmother about it, her stepmother simply laughed at her. "You can go," she said, "if you finish all your chores around here and find something suitable to wear." Of course, this was just another way to ensure Cinderella wouldn't attend the ball. But with the help of her animal friends, Yak and Gus, the mice and the birds, Cinderella managed to finish all her work and even found an old dress that might have worked. However, as she was getting ready to leave, her stepsisters came into her room, tore her dress apart and left her sobbing in the garden. As Cinderella cried, her fairy godmother appeared. "Don't worry, dear one," she said, waving her magic wand. Bibbidi. With that, a nearby pumpkin was transformed into a magnificent carriage. Gus and Yak were changed into horses. The stable boy Bruno became the coachman, and Lucifer, the big bad cat, became a footman. Then the fairy godmother turned Cinderella's rags into a beautiful blue ball gown and gave her a pair of shimmering glass slippers. "Oh, thank you, fairy godmother," Cinderella said, "but how am I supposed to get home?" With a pumpkin, the fairy godmother replied, "You can travel to the palace, but remember, the magic will only last until midnight. If you aren't home by then, the spell will break and you will become who you once were." Cinderella thanked her fairy godmother again and raced toward the palace in the pumpkin carriage. When she arrived, Cinderella noticed everyone staring at her in amazement. Even the prince couldn't take his eyes off her. As the other ladies entered the ballroom with their escorts, Cinderella stood awkwardly by the door, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, the prince walked over to her and asked, "May I have the pleasure?" Startled, Cinderella nodded and took his arm. And in an instant, the prince and Cinderella were swept up in a magical waltz around the ballroom. They talked and danced for hours, and neither noticed the passing time. But then Cinderella heard the clock begin to strike 12. In a panic, she fled the ballroom. She ran down a long hallway and down a flight of steep stairs. In her rush to get away, she lost one of her glass slippers. When the prince saw that Cinderella had escaped, he was heartbroken, but he was determined to find her. He ordered the Grand Duke to assemble his men and search every house in the kingdom for the girl whose foot fit the delicate glass slipper. The Grand Duke travelled far and wide, but no one could fit into the shoe. Finally, he arrived at Cinderella's house. He was met at the door by Cinderella's stepmother, who knew her wicked plan was in danger of being discovered. She quickly ushered him inside and forced Cinderella's mice friends to hide behind the wardrobe. The Grand Duke asked if he could speak to the young woman who lived there. "She isn't here," her stepmother lied. "If you would like to wait for her return, you are welcome to do so." The Duke decided to wait, and the stepmother led him to a nearby chair. When Cinderella's mice friends heard this, they begged her to come downstairs and try on the shoe. Cinderella refused, though she didn't want her stepsisters to mock her, so she hid under the bed instead. After a while, the Grand Duke asked if Cinderella could come down and try on the shoe. But her stepmother told him that her stepdaughter was locked in her attic room because she had stolen some clothes. "And besides," she said, "she isn't pretty enough for the prince anyway." Cinderella's mouse friends became very scared when they heard their friend would be locked in the attic, so they quickly scurried out the window and raced up to the roof. They pushed open the chimney, climbed through, and went up to Cinderella's room. "We have to get you downstairs," Gus whispered. "The Duke wants you to try on the shoe." Cinderella was terrified, but with the help of the birds, the mice broke the lock and freed her from her room. As Cinderella ran down the stairs, the Grand Duke watched in astonishment. She was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. Just then, Drizella and Anastasia came running. "Let us try on the shoe. Oh, please," they begged. The Grand Duke agreed and helped them each take a seat, but their feet were far too big for the shoe. In a moment of anger, Cinderella's stepmother slammed her hand on the table, knocking the glass shoe off the mantel and onto the floor. It fell apart, and one piece landed under the table. The Grand Duke looked at Cinderella and said, "I'm sorry, but it looks like you won't get a chance to try it on." Cinderella looked under the table and pulled out the broken pieces of the shoe. To the shock of everyone in the room, Cinderella pulled out the other half of the shoe. "I believe this belongs with this," she said. The Grand Duke took the shoe from Cinderella, placed it on her foot, and it fit perfectly. Everyone in the room gasped. The Grand Duke bowed and said, "Lady, you are the girl from the ball." Cinderella curtsied and smiled. Then the Duke escorted her to the carriage, and they raced off to the palace. When they arrived, everyone cheered, and the prince embraced Cinderella. At last, he said, "I thought I would never see you again." Cinderella and the prince then danced together as the entire kingdom celebrated. A few days later, Cinderella was dressed in a beautiful wedding gown and walked down the aisle toward the altar. The prince waited for her at the end of the aisle, and when their eyes met, he smiled. Cinderella and the prince then exchanged vows and were pronounced man and wife. Everyone cheered as they exited the church together and began their new life as the king and queen. Meanwhile, back at the house, Cinderella's stepsisters were forced to watch the wedding from afar. Their hateful plans had failed, and they knew they had no one else to blame but themselves. They were furious, but there was nothing they could do. So that is the story of Cinderella. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out our other videos. Thanks for watching.